Welcome everyone. We are so excited to bring you this special event today. We are sitting down and having a conversation with the lovely gentleman from Talisman Partners.
So today we get a chance to bring something new to the Executive Performance Partners community, an opportunity to learn from elite sport, to understand what we as business leaders can do on a day-to-day basis to go from good to great and to take our performance to the next level.
All right, so to get us started, can we ask you to share your top tip for achieving high performance as a leader?
Well, I'll go first. I think, if there's so many different factors that contribute to strong leaders that are charismatic, authentic, that want to take people with them. But one of the key traits that I always thought, particularly in my sporting days, was consistency, regardless of what's going on. The way that they approached their preparation for everything, the way they approached their day-to-day. But also, more importantly, regardless of what was going on on the field or in the office or in the operations, they held that level so that everyone knew how they were going to react regardless of the situation. It was a really key learning for me, I think. If I look at guys like George Gregan and John Eales, I guess speaking a little bit out of context, but the world might have been falling in, but they held themselves in a way that no one else would know that they would have a lot of pressure on them, and I think that the way they sheltered their team and led them forward from there allowed everyone to attach themselves to them and have confidence that they were making the right decisions. And I know that, my time with Grant, him running mining operations, things could be going, north or south, and you wouldn't know because he's very consistent in the way that he approached his workforce, the way that he approached his contractors, and, be interested to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Oh yeah, it's a really good point. I think consistency is massive, and it probably speaks a lot to one of the things that I think really exceptional leaders do is they take their roles, their responsibilities, their accountabilities exceptionally seriously, but they tend not to take themselves too seriously. And I think that boils down to authenticity, humility, and people can really engage and follow that into battle. And I think that's a really key trait of an effective leader.
Yeah, and I'd agree, of course, the consistency, but I also think that really effective leaders, they check what their beliefs are.
Yes.
And so coming from the sport of rowing where the environment, you're not actually able to communicate a lot when you're in the boat. And so a lot of the strategies around your goals and what people's roles are and, how you're going to execute something at the highest level is done off water. And so there's an assumption that we need to get on the same page before we begin. And we need to do that every single day if you're going to execute things at the highest possible level. And so I found that, a lot of leaders, they assume that just because we were on the same page yesterday, that we're going to be on the same page today.
Right.
And the reality is that in between yesterday and today, a whole heap of things have gone on in people's lives, and they've typically scattered. And I think it's just a good assumption. So I found that, effective leaders really do check, well, what are their assumptions around whether people are going to be aligned or not, and the necessary task of just bringing people back together constantly. Literally constantly, and just checking in all the time.
Yeah.
But when you're in a boat and you don't have that ability to sort of, the stroke can't talk to the bowman, did you have also little checkpoints along the way where you could, have subtle communications and adapt on the fly?
Yeah,
during the
in
race?
training, you definitely can.
Training,
you can take little moments, but at the end of the day, when the race, that's one of the unique things about rowing is that when the race starts, there's literally no stopping, and you can't stop. Well, that has happened, but you shouldn't stop. But anyway, that's the importance of setting up your communication prior to that event, so that everybody knows. We would have what we call reference points, where we would check in. It might be a particular stroke, part of the stroke, where you're just checking in that we're all aligned, that we're all hitting the same point at the same time, and particularly when it's the difference between 100th of a second, one oar going in or out of the water and you're taking 40 strokes per minute. It's really hard to do, and just the degree to which you have to, communicate and get your message across before you get on the water. So I always kept that in mind, and a lot of the work that I've done lately just keeps pointing back to that. It's just make sure you're having those in-depth conversations, checking for understanding, and the more work I've done in sport as well, coaches assume that their players understand their role. They assume that we understand our goals, but things change constantly. And you can communicate it, but you don't know that the message has been received until you ask them to repeat it back and do all of those fundamentals of communication.
And we see that crossover in business. That idea of consistency is really important, but that idea, Bo, of checking in to make sure that we're still aligned. You know, we've
Yeah.
gone home after a busy day at work and our world has changed by the time we get back in. So we're seeing in business the idea of that daily huddle, hey, are we on the same
Yeah.
plan and moving forwards? Links to our second question. So looking at the world of business, we believe that there's a lot that we can learn from the world of elite sport in business and probably vice versa. But with your guys' backgrounds at Talisman, what would you say the world of business can learn from the world of sport?
Well, I think one of the biggest lessons I've learned from the two guys sitting either side of me from high performance sport is that the best teams, they review whether they win, lose or draw. They review. And one of the things I've found perhaps in business that we don't do exceptionally well is review when things go well as when we've missed or we've had an incident or we've performed poorly. And I think that constant review and asking why, why did that happen? Let's get to the root cause of it. Let's either deal with the issue or come up with an action plan. Or on the flip side, when something's gone exceptionally well, it's equally important to review because there's a lot of lessons that we can learn there, take them forward to tomorrow and make sure that we compound those wins and win more often ultimately.
I was always amazed when I retired from sport. You spend so much time preparing, performing, and then reviewing, and you came out into the business world, and everyone just sort of prepares and performs, and then they go back to preparing and performing again, and you miss a really important opportunity. Then not just what Grant mentioned there, but you also get to celebrate some successes along the way, but also have individual learnings for people because you may review as a team, but also once the team's viewed that, players themselves can then actually understand their contribution to each part of the performance, I suppose, and more importantly, it creates a forum whereby you can celebrate those successes or acknowledge people in a way that they wouldn't not necessarily be acknowledged. A really quick example of is in a review session in my sport in rugby union. The public generally see wingers scoring tries in the corner, and that's celebrated, and everyone can see that. But what was really important was the front rowers' contribution towards that no one else saw. A tackle back in the defensive line, another tackle, then making the effort to go around the ruck and close off the defence. They get the opposition are forced to attack where we're strongest because he's closed that off. There's a turnover created and the ball goes wide to the winger, and you get that opportunity to say, hey, listen, thanks for making that discretionary effort that no one else would normally typically see. So, to Grant's point, I think that's a really big gap, I think, between sport and business in many companies.
So calling out where people are setting up other people for success is
Correct.
not just the spotlight.
Correct.
The spotlight moments, and part of what I'm also hearing is there's a reflection, a curiosity, just one of my favourite words, but also looking for what's the root cause, what really drove our success, or what really was at the core of us not winning or not getting the results we wanted at that particular moment, so that we can learn from that and do better next time.
Yeah, I think one of the key things there is that even talking about root cause is that there's many causes, and it's actually reflecting on all of the little things that created the big thing, making that happen. And I think the other big thing that sport teaches business is, well, what does winning actually look like? And the reality is that you go to the Olympics and not everyone is actually there to win. Some people are there to make a final, some are there to win a medal, but there is real clarity over what winning looks like for your respective team. And in business, whether that's a number, profitability, or whether it's in mining, how many tons, or a safety record or something like that. The thing is that clarity around that helps people genuinely understand on a day-to-day basis, what am I personally doing to contribute to that outcome? And it's actually really transparent. And as the guys are saying, when someone does do a good job in contributing to that win, there's some recognition for it. And it's a pat on the back, usually. I think that one of the funny things about rowing that is a little unique is that there's no individual statistic. And you sort of grow up accepting that there's no individual recognition. You can't come off the water and having lost the race, but saying, well, yeah, I actually had a pretty good row. By the same token, if the crew wins, everyone has contributed to that equally in some way. And so I think that there's some of the key lessons that business can sort of take. But in a meeting, for example, when you come together, you can literally talk about, hey, what is a win going to look like? We start all of our conversations, whether it's a meeting with a client or chatting amongst ourselves, or when Grant hosts our monthly catch-ups as a board of directors. it's literally, hey, what's a win going to look like for us today in this particular meeting? And we say, if it's with a client, for example, it might just be, hey, we just want to be aligned around getting the next meeting.
Yep.
It's not to completely get the deal over the line and to win a heap of business. It's like let's just get the next meeting. And it creates a way that we all understand how we need to conduct ourselves in order just to get to that small outcome. We go, that's a win.
I love the focus in that, and in a world, I think you probably have the same circumstance where pretty much every single person we're working with is saying, my calendar is overcrowded, I've got so many meetings, we spend so much time in meetings. And when you challenge and you say, well, okay, well, what's your purpose in that meeting? What's the agenda? And essentially what you're saying is, what are we here to do? We're not going to do anything above or below that, anything beside that. We're going to be really focused, we're going to do that thing, and then, hey, we might actually free up our time to go and do other things that might be...
I actually think that that's a really good point, because in sport, you physically only have so much energy to give. Even emotionally, when you're training to break a world record or win a gold medal, it is such an emotionally draining thing to do. And to waste your time doing things that don't contribute to that outcome. And so it helped me really prioritize things. I can really easily just push, and just focus on that key thing. Because you've only got so much energy.
It's a really interesting point, and something that we talk to our leaders about a lot is what does success look like, which is that preparation piece. Then you've got the execution piece, which is the meeting, and then just that short moment at the end to reflect back and say, did we nail the objective? I think it's a really good takeaway to break each meeting down into that cadence. How are we going to prepare? What does success look like? Let's execute. Now let's reflect what went well, what didn't.
Yeah.
It's a really good takeaway.
Yeah, it's all those micro chunks, because that's the thing in sport, you're doing that literally every single moment. And I think the other thing too, which is interesting from like sport, which is challenging in the mining industry, for example, what I learned about that industry, and Grant's lived it for a long time, it is relentless. People use the word relentless a lot, but that is genuinely relentless. It never stops. Whereas in sport, you get that opportunity to have a season, and then there is some downtime where you can literally recharge your batteries. And so, yeah, I'm always interested in that industry. How do people literally take that moment to recharge when the operation is running 24/7 every single day of the week?
Which is businesses in general, right?
Yeah,
That's
it
right.
just
Yeah.
doesn't stop. Yeah, whereas sport does, so, you know.
Which is a beautiful segue into our next question. Getting to the top is one thing, staying there is another thing entirely. What would your advice to leaders be in terms of staying at their version of peak performance? I think that's a beautiful observation.
Yeah,
that you've
I mean,
made.
I think that one of the key things there is what I've seen on teams that are sustainably successful is that they've set that up as a goal to begin with. Like the really successful teams never talk about winning once. You know, they've already set up as a strategy that, you know, we're going to win for the next 5 or 6 years, that we aim to be consistently in this level of the competition. And sometimes, obviously, you win a championship, and some other years you don't. Not everything is in your control.
Yes.
That's one thing to realise, but you have to have people there that from one year to the next are almost continually dissatisfied. Yeah, if you've got people on your team that are there literally to win once, and once they have, their level of motivation sort of declines because they've hit that target, that's not going to work. And so I think there's always that healthy level of turnover with your own, you know, staff, and looking for people that are really, really committed to that type of outcome. I actually think is important. You know, I reflect back on some of the guys I rode with, and you know, that's part of the challenge, is that you always get this bell curve of desire, motivation, skill, ability. Even at the Olympic level, there's still a bell curve of that, and the challenge to get guys that are going to their first Olympics who literally are happy to be there, and so they should be. But I rode with a guy who won 2 Olympic gold medals, and when we sat down and talked about what our goal was, you know, he was still so extraordinarily motivated that it wasn't just a gold medal, he also wanted to break a world record and win the gold medal. And all of us have looked around and gone, oh, okay, that raises the standard.
Yeah.
So you got to have people like that.
I think that beautiful view of the bell curve and how do we bring that crew together really resonates in a business world, because not all of us can have that level of motivation, but how we bring those things together.
And I think it helps with structure and process around that. And, you know, it hurts me to say because of, I guess, the history that I've been through. But if you look at the All Blacks, they've certainly got people on all along that bell curve, but what you see from a very young age, they've actually structured their entire development pathway to be aligned. So they all learn the same skills from a very young age. The coaches all go through a coaching pathway, I guess. So right from day one, consistently the same things are taught, so that by the time they get to the All Blacks level, it's all inherently learned already. You know, they've just got to adapt a little bit and step up that level. So you sort of cater for both ends, having people in that bell curve, but having structure behind them to make sure that success is ongoing. And, you know, I always look at teams like the Melbourne Storm, and Bo's done a lot of work with the Melbourne Storm. You know, I wonder what structures underpin their success, you know.
Absolutely. I think that links beautifully to the idea of the rules for the game and how we play together. And the reality is, in business, we don't all have the same development pathways to get here. We inherit teams from different backgrounds and different skill sets and different motivations. So one of the things we talk to our leaders about all the time is, how do we set the rules for the game? How do we actually have that shared understanding of how we're going to play together? Because sometimes the why is known, but the how gets a little bit more challenging. So in terms of setting the rules for the game, what would be your advice for business leaders to ensure that the team understands how to play together towards that end outcome, whether it be the Olympic record or whether it be achieving a deal in business? How do we set those expectations of how to play together?
I actually think it's interesting, because when I even working with a lot of sporting teams around that concept, everyone talks about their values. We call them match-winning qualities.
Yes.
We have a group model. What are your goals? How does that translate down to your key qualities you want to live? What behaviours are going to contribute to that outcome? What I've found is that most people actually have that conversation, and it's done in the pre-season, or it's done at, you know, your yearly retreat. And it stays there.
Yes.
Like, honestly, even in sport, the really good teams have that conversation on a day-to-day basis.
Right.
And when someone does something really well, they link it back to, hey, that's a good example of living that quality. That's exactly what we're looking for. Or if it's not, and so again, people talk about above and below the line behaviour. They're all good strategies, but again, it's just making sure you actually live that. Honestly, I don't think there's any secrets to it other than that. And do you, as a leader, have that commitment to still be energised by those words that you chose? And are you willing to actually live it, role model it, and then engage with others so that they want to live those qualities daily too? So, I mean, did you find that?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting comment, because involvement, you know, from the broader workforce, from the broader team, the broader group, and Bo always speaks about it, you know, leads to ownership, which leads to accountability. And what we often forget is, if we don't involve people in understanding, first and foremost, have we got absolute clarity on what a win looks like, and why are we here, and what are we going to do? Secondly, you know, what is our match-winning equation, and how do we get there? That's that roadmap. So the qualities we're going to live day to day, and then it's about that sustainability. So as Bo said, it's not something that lives on a boardroom wall or at a retreat. We are constantly giving it a life. And the way that I live my match-winning qualities in my role might be slightly different to the way that you do them in your role, but we are highly aligned to that ultimate win for our organisation. And I think that clarity is the real piece that perhaps in business we lose from time to time, and we can learn a lot from sport, because you can look up at the scoreboard in sport and you know if you're winning and losing. And it's about creating that absolute clarity for all team members in all their roles, and so that they can actually be part of the bigger machine that's going to make that scoreboard win more often.
I think the key takeaway there for business is, I'm constantly talking to leaders who are telling us, well, I've told the team that. And I think the tip that we take away from this is, you can't over-communicate around what a win looks like. You can't over-communicate in terms of how we play the game. And Bo, I really took away from that around it becoming the language of the team rather than just the language of the leader. That when you're walking past the water cooler and you're hearing those words that are now not on the wall but between two team members, to me that's always a good sign that you've got a great culture that you can leverage. Sharpe?
It's a great point, David. I bore these guys to death on it, but if everyone reflects on the teams that they've been on in that have been successful, quite often it's the teams that self-regulate themselves that are the most successful, because it's not relying on one person to come in and demand excellence in one area. It's when the teams have owned what they're trying to achieve collectively, and they've got the courage to enforce that upon each other. And enforce is the wrong word, but they encourage each other to live those standards, you know. So you get to a point where you get a mass of people that want to go in the same direction. And it's a very powerful thing. And the key to that is translating it from the one person in the organisation leading that to having the team lead that for themselves, and the leader just steers them along.
That's that power of language as a leader, and we're having to role model it until it translates.
Yeah, yes.
We've heard leaders go, well, I've said it once, so the team should be having that culture of supporting each other.
Yeah.
I think as a leader, we have to be brave enough to go out there and say, I'm going to use those words off the wall, but I'm going to use them in day-to-day conversation rather than in our retreat or in the performance review, but it becomes part of the day-to-day language of the business.
And sometimes I've been in teams that were very high performing and teams that weren't so high performing, and you can create little mechanisms around that by formalising and asking people within your team to start supporting you in that journey, and then it becomes, it gathers that rolling stone gathers some moss, because you've got 2 or 3 people who you've lent on to say, look, I need some help pushing this through. You have a quiet conversation, and they organically help grow that through your team. So there's ways around that you can help, I guess, push that influence of a leader through an organisation.
You're almost getting through that inertia, aren't you, to start build some momentum, and what you're talking about is bringing in trusted advisors of sorts to kind of support you in doing that. And part of what I'm also hearing is have some genuine conversation using the values. Don't just say them or put them in a presentation or a speech or something. Actually have some real life conversation and some two-way dialogue around them, which helps everybody understand what they are, but also really reinforces that you know what they are, you're expecting people to live them, and you're holding yourself to those same standards.
Yeah, I think one of the other key things there, Andrea, too, is that we do, and look, I get it, we all talk about momentum. Sports commentators talk about it all the time, coaches talk about momentum.
Yes.
But I sort of had this belief that what if there was no such thing, okay, and that one act doesn't necessarily automatically lead to the next. So momentum is that belief that if I do one good thing well, it's automatically going to push the next domino over. So we talk to a lot of teams about, because you talk to any coach, it's one tackle at a time, or it's in rowing, it's one stroke at a time, and the next stroke, even though it looks like it's linked to the one before it, you have to actually recreate that success. And I think that that's part of the challenge here, is what we're talking about, even in terms of alignment, for example, is that you have to, on a daily basis, recreate what you had the previous day, as opposed to just expecting that, again, I push one domino and the rest are going to fall. Like I've found that sport, and it's actually healthy for athletes to think this way too, is that because they often believe, like the worst thing you can see with an athlete is they make one mistake and they compound that into the next, the next. Because they often have a belief that, oh my gosh, I made a mistake. Oh no, something bad's going to happen again. Right? Whereas the really good athletes, they don't link one thing to the next. They're very good at living in, whether we call it day-tight compartments or moment by moment. It's a game of 1,000 moments.
Yes.
And some of them you'll nail and get right, and some of them won't be quite so right. But your ability to go through what's necessary to recreate that outcome is really, really critical.
Just focusing on what you can control.
Yeah, absolutely,
Which is this right now, not that or the thing that's coming.
Yeah.
It speaks more broadly than just the cultural piece, and we do a lot of work around high reliability organisational theory.
Yeah.
And one of the key tenets of that is chronic unease, and it's the same with setting our match-winning qualities and defining what a win looks like. If we're not chronically uneasy about, is that still relevant today? Are people still aligned? Are we still heading in the same direction, rowing the boat, in synchronicity? Then we're actually failing ourselves. You've got to have that chronic unease. We've got to be relentless, and you've got to look back, as Bo said before, and just have that constant dissatisfaction that just because yesterday we were aligned, are we today? That's one of the key challenges.
Now, I think that HRA theory that Grant was referring to there, I mean, I know it's applied to industry where there's high risk and potentially catastrophic outcomes, but it actually works. That's something that business has done, which sport can actually borrow. Like the best coaches have got that feeling.
Yep.
They're not thinking what's going to go well today. I know it sounds really negative, but they are, right? They're actually thinking, hang on, what could hurt us today? Yep. Whether it's something physically which could create a physical injury, or is it something that could actually be detrimental for the team? What relationships are not working? So they're scanning in a totally different way, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, you must sleep a lot better no longer.
Yeah.
Having to,
That's right.
from a mining perspective, there's any number of things.
So the there's a level of vigilance kind of protecting against
Massive
getting to
vigilance,
places.
yeah. It's probably a good word for it, vigilance, right?
Yeah.
Around those
Sometimes,
areas.
Yeah.
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 Which I think leans quite nicely into this question around resilience and maintaining your grace under fire, because consistency, being on your A game, being vigilant, that's pretty tiring stuff, right? Day in, day out. What advice would you give leaders to help them maintain that level of resilience or grace under fire?
I think it's a recognition that success is not a linear line trending upwards. It goes up and down. You've got to expect the peaks and the troughs, no matter what you do. If you look at anyone who's accomplished success in any field, be it sport, business, they've gone through some tremendous lows along that way, and you've got to expect that. It's not an easy ride, and you know, what's that in terms of a graph that you go through to win anything? It's always a challenge, and I think leaders have to expect that. That's a part and parcel of leading a team.
I think that's one thing that athletes that are better tend to do well, is that they know that mistakes will come.
Yep.
And when that mistake arrives, I often use this little, I guess, analogy, is that, you know, everyone's had the unexpected visitor to their home, and they've called up on their way there, and they've given you 5 minutes, and basically now you've got to go and, oh my gosh, we've got to go clean the house.
Yes.
Right? And everyone knows what that feels like. Whereas for an athlete, the cleaning of the house is like, actually, my house is already clean. Okay, I'm happy for anyone to drop around at any given time. And it's the same with mistakes. If they're not expecting a mistake's going to happen, they're literally going around fighting for a strategy to deal with it. Whereas when they know that mistakes will happen, and these are my strategies, this is what I've got planned in order to actually get myself back on track. So the best athletes, the same as the most successful people, they tend to just have the best recovery strategies. And that's not just in terms of the actual moment-by-moment recovery, but also I think that's something that in sport we tend to do a lot of. You know, I learnt from my coach, he's a 8-time Olympic coach, Olympic gold medal coach. What he focused a lot on was the active recovery. Recovery is not sitting in front of the TV or having a beer after work.
Not a
I
Netflix
mean, that,
binge?
you know, from a business perspective, I mean, even in sport, but active recovery is doing something to physically reinvigorate yourself,
Yes.
you know, to emotionally reinvigorate yourself, something. And what works for different people works for different people. I mean, there's a lot of research on that now. The only difference with sport is that they actually utilize all that research to a really high level. Yeah.
I think the best leaders, the most effective leaders, they iron out the highs and lows of their emotions, so that, you know, even in the best of times or the worst of times, there is that consistency. They've ironed out those highs and lows, and without giving away their authenticity. But that is the really effective leader. They take out the massive highs and the massive lows.
Do you think you keep the bigger picture perspective, knowing that there's going to be ups and downs along the way?
Yep.
We're still on track. Today's not a great day. Tomorrow will be a new day.
Yep.
The bigger picture is still intact.
And they understand the shadow that they cast,
Yeah.
and the positive impact that can have, or the negative, detrimental impact that can have.
That makes a lot of sense. So, gents, we're moving into a certain time of the year where we're starting to prepare for reviewing our years that were and also setting up. So we're going to ask for some top tips to close out today. One of the top tips we get asked from our leaders all the time is all of our team members have strengths, and conversely we have areas we're not so strong in. So for each of you, what would be the top tip to help teams identify where the individuals have their strengths, but critically to have that conversation where someone isn't so strong in that area, and making sure they're spending time where they're strong rather than in areas where they're struggling? What would your thoughts be on that?
Oh, I think it's getting back to Andrea's point. Everyone's so busy these days. You've actually got to firstly take the time to go and understand that, because you can't commit 5 minutes of a day to try and pull that together.
Yep.
You've actually got a plan for that, and a lot of the things we're talking about today, and you guys know, more than anyone, you've actually got to put some structure around how you pull those things together. So, I guess my top tip would be take the time to actually invest in your people in that way, because if you hope that it's going to happen and you can, spend 15 minutes doing that, it's not going to yield a result.
So the tip there is to invest the time to have that conversation around here's where I see your strengths and here's
I guess the tip is everyone's busy, you get that, at some stage you've got to rip the Band-Aid off and take the time.
Wonderful. Yeah, perfect. Right.
Yeah, I'd say Bo often reflects that relationships are a performance factor. So invest in relationships, invest in getting to know yourself, your teammates, how you interact, how you work more effectively. And then the second part of it, going to that piece of those tough conversations, is I'm a massive believer in you've got to choose your hard in life. And sometimes it's hard to have a tough conversation. But you know what's harder? Not doing it compounding and becoming a massive problem down the path. And that's analogous to a safety issue, that's analogous to a detrimental relationship. It could be not communicating effectively about challenges within the business. Choose your hard, and when you decide to choose that first hard, invariably it makes for a more effective process.
And the next one's easier.
Yeah.
Well, I actually really like what Grant says there, because I'll give another one, but that concept is one I hadn't really heard of before, like in your industry, right? The hard is catastrophic.
Yeah.
In sport, you just lose a game, or you don't perform very well at the Olympics. And as detrimental as that can be, and as impactful on someone's life as it can be, and it certainly is, the reality is you can recover from that. Life does go on. But, in terms of, I think it supports what all of our businesses are about, really, in terms of my number one tip. Like, there's not a single athlete that is going to be successful on their own.
Yep.
Yeah.
Honestly, they need a coach. I still talk to my coach. Yeah, and yes, the conversations are different, but he offers me a really unique perspective on a whole range of different things. And so having someone who you can get some honest feedback off. So you should be looking at this point in time, you should be looking for someone in your organisation. It can be a mentor, but typically someone where you can, and I read that before in a lot of research on leadership, that the best leaders actively solicit feedback. And they do it in such a way that it's not just an end of year. It's like, hey, how are we doing? Am I doing all right? What can I do better? And they're mature enough to accept we try to create that with athletes too. And some of the best teams I work with, they actually gotten to the point where they're willing to have those really honest and real conversations. It's actually extraordinarily rare, because most people are pretty relationship oriented and they value harmony over honesty.
Absolutely.
And so when you can get to a point where you've got someone in your corner who's willing to actually, you know what, you needed to do a better job with that, but it's done regularly and often. And that's why coaching is such a valued thing. I mean, literally, an athlete will not be successful without their coach.
The interesting golden thread there was relationships and frequency. So relationships, we all know, but how frequently do we invest in it? It can't be a conversation once a year, even if it's for 2 days. It's the regular touch point. So that links very closely to something that we see out there in business called leadership as a contact sport, and ties that analogy between business and sport beautifully together.
Gentlemen, it has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for sharing your genius. I think there's a lot of consistency and some really beautiful gold nuggets in what you've shared, so I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thanks very much for having me.
Cheers.